Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Abbas Kadhim, the director of the Iraqi Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Welcome and thank you for coming. It's great to see you. And it is an honor and a pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, His Excellency Dr. Fareed Yasseen, the Ambassador of the Republic of Iraq to the United States. And I cannot even start talking about what kind of a pleasure having him. He is one of the people that I always look up to and one of the Iraqi statesmen that we have, and we would like to have as many of him as we can. The ambassador previously served as Iraq's ambassador to France for 6.5 years until he stepped down in 2016. And prior to the end of his tenure in Paris, he was awarded the Republican Medal of Honor, rarely given award to any outgoing ambassador, and it was given to him on behalf of the French presidency. Before serving as Iraq's representative to France, Ambassador Yasseen held a number of posts within the government of Iraq, including the head of policy planning at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he was a diplomatic advisor to former Deputy President, Mr. Adel Abdel Mahdi, who is Iraq's current Prime Minister. He also worked and consulted for numerous United Nations agencies and leading think tanks, and he is well known particularly for his excellent work for the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ambassador Yasseen has a very extensive and lucrative education all the way from Iraq to Switzerland to the United States, MIT. Prior to joining the diplomatic service, he was trained as a physicist and worked as a researcher in Europe, the United States, and later developed strong interest in political activism and, of course, human rights advocacy. His experience and achievements will prove vital in contributing towards a closer relationship with the U.S. and Iraq for the balance of his term here, and also for whatever other endeavors that we will have in other countries or also back in Iraq. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce him and to have him give introductory remarks here before we sit and talk about various issues on Iraq. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
They told me they specialize in ambushing here at the Atlantic Council. Well, first I'd like to start by thanking the Atlantic Council, Iraq's initiative, for hosting me. The Atlantic Council's Iraq Initiative has a reputation in Iraq. A few years ago it was reputed to be forming Iraq's next government, so thank you for inviting me. Now, this is really a big crowd. I want to thank you all for coming. I recognize a lot of friends, but I can't acknowledge every one of you. Allow me just to single out three people. First, Sarud Najib, whom I called just a few days ago to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the bombing of the Foreign Ministry. We were both serving there at the time, and only 3 ambassadors were to be found. He was one of them, and his role was really heroic. I know that he carried on his back wounded people from the 9th floor down to the ground floor. Sarud Najib, he's right over here. And the second I'd like to single out is my colleague Wafar Jalil, who is my DCM. Please stand up. I'm really happy that he's here because, amongst other things, he comes with a lot of experience in consular affairs. He was deputy head of the consular division at the foreign ministry. So, you know, when you have visa issues and otherwise, go to him. Don't come to me. And the third person I'd like to acknowledge is Abbas Kadhim. Thank you for pointing out my academic achievements. They came because I had parents who were steeped in education. But I'm really awed by yours. I say that, very, very matter of fact. Your academic achievements are really stellar. And the difficulties you had to overcome to get to where we are right here are worthy of a book, and I'm waiting to read it. And then once that book is done, I'm waiting for the movie. So, anyway, the fact that you're all here, many, is witness to the fact that Iraq is and has been a newsworthy topic for quite some time. And I remember with nostalgia times when Iraq was not so newsworthy. I look forward to a time when Iraq, again, will be less newsworthy, or at least newsworthy in a different vein. Before getting to the core of my subject, allow me to note that today is Ashura, an official holiday in Iraq. In his recent book, General Mattis, to illustrate the fallibility of humans, says that the last perfect man on earth died on a cross long ago. Ashura celebrates another quite perfect man who died beheaded in Iraq more than 13 centuries ago because he was standing for what was right. He lost that battle, but he won an everlasting symbolic victory. I mention this for two reasons. First, to underline the importance of history to all Iraqis, and for good reason, because we have more history than anybody else on the planet. And this is why we stand firm on recovering all our stolen archaeological artifacts. Second, I want to stress the importance of symbolism and faith to the overwhelming majority of Iraqis. This is illustrated in the premise of our Constitution, in which we recognize Iraq to be, and I'm quoting, the homeland of apostles and prophets. Please note the plural, this is important. Not recognizing the symbolism, the importance of symbolism and faith will make it very difficult for outsiders to understand Iraqis. Now, where do we stand in Iraq in this period of increased regional tensions? I represent Iraq's democratically elected government, and so allow me to spell out some of the basic principles that determine Iraq's policies, both internal and external. First, important point, we want no more conflict. Iraq has been subjected to external conflict for almost 40 years, and internal conflicts for even longer. Nor do we believe in proxy wars, and this thus will not allow Iraq to be an arena of confrontation for regional or global foes or even competitors. This is why we seek peace in the region and peace at home. Practically, this means that we will not take sides in any regional conflict. For example, the United States is Iraq's partner, friend, and ally in its war against terror. Iran is Iraq's neighbor with whom we share long borders, mutual history, and strong relations. We will not take sides, but as should be, look to preserve Iraq's interests. We are, because of our experience with them, opposed to sanctions, because we believe that they make people suffer, and believe that the best way forward is through negotiations. If needed, we stand ready to offer assistance needed to explore such avenues. We will also reach out to all of our immediate neighbors and to strengthen our ties with them, economic or otherwise. Indeed, we have already begun to do so. Witnessed the numerous exchanges of visits between Iraqi and regional leaders that have had tangible results. For example, the various agreements on electricity that have or will be signed with Turkey, Jordan, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. We're also increasing our outreach to global powers in order to advance our bilateral ties. With regard to the United States, our prime partner amongst world powers, we are seeking to strengthen and broaden our ties through a more comprehensive implementation of our strategic framework agreement to include greater cooperation and exchange in trade, energy, and culture. Simply put, we would like U.S. businesses and U.S. society to have a role in the reconstruction of Iraq as effective as that of U.S. armed forces in helping us to defeat ISIS. This role, carried out at the request and with the authorization of the Iraqi government, has been crucial in defeating ISIS, and we acknowledge and are grateful for it. And I'll repeat this, we acknowledge and are grateful for this. This role is not over, as those who have watched David Muir on Nightline yesterday can attest to. Iraqi forces are still addressing remaining ISIS pockets with the support of the coalition. As ever, we will protect Iraqi sovereignty and will seek with our partners to develop the means to do so. That includes having full control of our airspace. Recent events have only strengthened the government's commitment to this issue. The fight against ISIS has been daunting. It required the contributions of all of Iraq's different communities and all of Iraq's armed forces, counterterrorism, army, federal police, popular and tribal mobilizations, and the Peshmerga. All paid a heavy price. And in many ways, this shared sacrifice strengthened the unity of the Iraqi people. We are now in a post-major conflict phase, with all that implies in terms of transition. This is the reason for the executive orders calling for the incorporation of the popular mobilizations with Iraq's regular forces under the Prime Minister as Commander-in-Chief. This also has implications for coalition forces in Iraq, whose role will gradually shift from advise and assist to train and equip. Iraq is now broadly stable, and I can attest to that. I just came back from 2 weeks in Baghdad, and my overwhelming impression, and this is not in the text, is that the green zone is very busy in terms of traffic. You used to have practically no cars there, but now, because there is no green zone, in fact, traffic has gone into the green zone. And as a result, it's decongested the rest of Baghdad, so everybody's happy. So it is broadly stable, and the government's ability to achieve this kind of stability is no small measure of success. This stability sets the stage for the government's other critical objectives, mainly reconstruction, boosting the economy, creating jobs, providing services, and most importantly, ensuring the return of the IDPs to their homelands, especially minorities, and safe return. It will be difficult for us to do this on our own. We will need the support of the coalition and regional partners with investment and expertise. That was the objective of last year's Kuwait conference. We do recognize, however, that many difficulties need to be addressed in order to make Iraq more attractive to foreign investors and companies. In particular, we recognize that our investment climate is hardly welcoming. And this is why the government recently initiated a series of packages aiming to improve the investment climate through, for example, simplifying access to land, allowing the creation of holding companies, setting up a framework for public-private partnerships, unifying procedures at border crossings, and importantly, providing mechanisms for the resolution of disputes. Our key objectives are twofold. One, to diversify Iraq's economy and render it less dependent on the price of oil. Two, to create private sector jobs to absorb our youth and to reduce the government's growing wage bill, which prevents it from funding key infrastructure projects. One promising sector that is attracting the government's attention is agriculture. I remember Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi, himself an economist, making the point that prior to the 1958 coup d'etat or revolution, depending on your political affiliations, call it what you will, Iraq's budget was derived essentially from taxes on agricultural exports, allowing Iraq's oil income to be devoted, such as it was, to infrastructure projects and key sectors like education, including the construction of buildings designed by Walter Gropius and Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier. Some of them are still standing. Our oil sector is doing well and attracting worldwide attention. Iraq is now OPEC's second producer, and we look forward to expanding our production capacity to reach and remain at around 6 million barrels per day, with the help of partners from the United States. It is no secret that Iraq is in intense discussions with ExxonMobil. Personally, I wish that ExxonMobil were less of a shareholder company and more of a stakeholder company. That's for them to decide. We are working with them and other companies, in particular Bechtel and Honeywell, to capture our flared gas and to turn it into electricity, thereby saving money and helping reduce Iraq's greenhouse gas emissions. Here's my background in climate change. Internally, there is a measure of consensus that facilitates the work of the government. The Prime Minister's appointment itself came through consensus of all major political players. The government is working diligently on improving shortcomings in Iraq's governments, including the relationship between federal government and the KRG, as well as the various governorates, the scourge of corruption, and ensuring the safe and durable return of some 1.5 million IDPs, including representatives of minorities, to their homelands. not to mention the issue, and it's a critical one, of tens of thousands of ISIS survivors, including many children and widows. This is a problem that is fraught and needs to be addressed globally. It is a legacy of a war where Iraq was at the forefront, fighting a global force drawn from some 100 countries, driven by an ideology that threatens us all. We must all come together to ensure that this danger is no longer there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. It's great to sit with you. We normally sit in different settings, so I'm not going to change the conversation. It is always with you an intellectual conversation, and there is a lot that we can learn from someone like you, with not just with your academic background, but also with your diplomatic background. I must say that I spent a few weeks recently at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs doing some task that got me to meet many people who are candidates to be ambassadors. They are the advanced cadre of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and to their credit, the Iraqis are trying to depoliticize this process. And one thing that I noticed, that many people that wanted to impress the committee that I was part of, they mentioned that they worked with Dr. Fareed Yasseen. So it is something
I want their names.
Once that the process is over, I will be happy to share a few with you. But it is really a testament to your impact on the people who worked with you.
Actually, it's a testament to longevity.
That too, but some longevity can hurt sometimes, so yours worked in the right direction. Let me ask you and start from where you were talking about. You just came back from Baghdad, and it is always something that is going on new in Baghdad. Every time I go there, there are many changes. I think you alluded to the sense of security, relaxation, and also now you can see more of Baghdad.
Normalcy, actually.
Normalcy, and in the old days you drove in Baghdad and the streets were like tunnels with these high T-walls and all of that. Now you see the city. But at the political side, what else that you can tell us about Baghdad and report about this? Of course, there are a few things that I'm thinking of. And you just passed the government that is past the summer, probably the first summer before any demonstrations took place, and people were thinking that there would be demonstrations. To what you attribute this? And also, I would like to hear from you about a new development that should be a welcome development in Iraq, which is the formation of an official opposition to complete the picture of Iraqi parliamentary politics. I would like to have your thoughts on it, and where do you see this at this stage?
Next question. Thank you for this. Look, thank you for bringing me. I have to tell you that Dr. Abbas really raised the level of the discussions amongst the diplomats wishing to become ambassadors. They all acknowledged his importance, and they're all fearful of him. Well, thank you for this. Look, what struck me in Iraq in terms of the political situations is really the sense of normalcy. People are going about their businesses. I was almost in the impression that there is sort of a parallel Baghdad that you witness and see and don't read about in the newspapers. And certainly is not consistent with the kind of stance that many governments take vis-a-vis to the travel of their citizens to Iraq. And to us, it's a real hindrance, because we think it prevents business from taking place and the economy from being jump-started. And God knows we need European and American expertise There is a general consensus that there is some sort of stability being there. Like I said, the Prime Minister was chosen as a consensus candidate between many different political blocs. He himself is the French have this wonderful word, rassembleur, he sort of uniter. I don't want to get into American politics, but he's a uniter, not a divider. Really. And enjoys really good relationships individually with most of the major political players. And to add to this, there is a general consensus along the main lines of where Iraq is going. You remember the big issues that arose a few months ago regarding the presence of American troops in Iraq. Well, the three major leaderships in Iraq, the presidency, the Council of Representatives, the President of the Republic, the Prime Minister as the President of the Council of Ministers, all were united to agree that we needed a continued presence of coalition forces in Iraq because the fight against ISIS isn't completely over. And this actually, the support was also found in the major political players in Iraq. So on the emergence of an opposition, it's actually a very significant development because, and I'm here paraphrasing Hoshar Zebari, who was my boss for over 10 years. He said that we had developed in Iraq because of our diversity, because of the will to bring in everybody under the tent, an Iraqi way of doing business. So if you take some sort of regional election, okay, the winners would get to appoint the governor, but those who would come second would get to appoint the president of the council of the provincial council. Those who came in third would get to appoint the head of police. So it's a sharing of the positions of decision making. It brings everybody under the tent, but at the same time, it makes decision making quite difficult because you have more moving parts. And so I think at this point, a lot of people are thinking that maybe we need to have something that is more compact and something that can address issues much more quickly. Hence the need for an opposition, hence the need also for an opposition that keeps watch and that maintains true religion in the politicians who hold power. I think it's a sign of the maturation of the Iraqi political process.
I agree. I think you can't have parliamentary politics without a vibrant opposition movement that does what a true opposition normally does, which is basically...
And sometimes being in the opposition is more fun than being in government.
That too, it helps. You could criticize without having to pay attention. So let me ask you move a little bit more towards here, Washington, and also from your trip to Baghdad, and it's the prospects of U.S.-Iraqi relations as you see them and as you are working on this issue daily. One of the challenges is basically that we are in Washington witnessing more focus not on the U.S.-Iraqi policy, but more really, that's my observation, and also there are many facts on the ground that probably support that, is that Iraq policy has been more about U.S.-Iran policy than it is an Iraq policy for its own sake, and I have spoke about that often in a critical way. How do we move from that kind of setting where the U.S. is subordinating its foreign policy towards Iraq to its bigger picture of the Iranian dominance of the interests and focus of U.S. policymakers to an Iraq policy that is, it provides two things that I see lacking. One of them is the continuity, and second, a policy as a strategy rather than just chasing moving targets and, as what I called it in one of my pieces, opting for the lesser evil.
Well, thank you. This is actually a critical issue. Of course, American foreign policy is determined by the president and by the president's priorities. And I owe this insight to Doug Ollivant, who's right here. Thank you for this insight. Iraq was tied to this administration's foreign policy because of ISIS. ISIS was declared to be one of the objectives of the president. The president wanted to get rid of ISIS. And so when we defeated ISIS territorially, the urgency of Iraq as a matter of policy, I don't want to say waned, but became somewhat less urgent. So this is part of natural development. And our challenge is to convince our American friends that Iraq is worthy because of its own sake. And there are many ways in which we can do that. The model that I have in mind, to be frank with you, is Vietnam. You know, Vietnam, we don't need to go back to the history, but American-Vietnamese relationships are flourishing. Why? Because of the economy. Why? Because of the role of U.S. veterans who fought in Vietnam, who were critical in promoting business interests. And so now we see that the relationships between Vietnam and the United States are soaring. And so we have had, in the last 15 years or so, something like close to 1 million American servicemen cycle through Iraq. Many of these people are now involved in businesses. It's incumbent me and the other Iraqis and the Iraqi community of the United States to try to entice them to come and see that, you know, what they have done, what they were part of, is really worth it, and to give them opportunities for scenarios that would lead to mutual win-wins. So all of this in the economic sector, but there is more to it than that. I'd like to remind people of what kind of thing that the United States can give to us. Of course, we always talk about you know, the contributions of the United States military to the defeat of ISIS. But we find ourselves in a situation that is similar to that of the United States right after World War II. And here I think we really need to import some of your expertise with your help. One of the challenges, I talked earlier about the popular mobilizations. Well, beyond the popular mobilizations and the Peshmerga and the Iraqi armed forces and the counter-terror, we have a society that is over-militarized. And it was a necessity because we had a purpose for this. We needed to build up a military to be able to defeat ISIS, just as you, the United States, had to build up a military practically from scratch to defeat the Axis powers during World War II. Well, what happened right after that? The United States came up with a series of schemes that transformed this fighting power into the most potent economic engine ever. Things like the GI Bill, things like economic projects like Levittown's, which addressed the housing needs of all these returning servicemen. We have the very same problems in Iraq. We have an over-militarized society, young people that are looking for futures. What better answer, what better tools can we give them than to give them a useful education? I mean, I'm a plasma physicist. Many of the books I read were authored by people who were operating radars and radios in the Army during the Second World War, and then who went on to study electrical engineering and then became leaders in their fields. This is the kind of thing that we need in Iraq. So that's the kind of expertise that we look forward to acquiring from the United States.
And these are already in a form of an agreement that Iraq had with the United States. I mean, as we recall, in 2008, Iraq signed two agreements with the United States. One of them is no longer in effect because it ended by the end of 2011.
And I wish it hadn't.
And yeah, we all had our own sort of thoughts about that, but there are arguments on both sides, and definitely we know in the hindsight, I mean, what you say is absolutely correct. But the valid one that is still in effect, which is the Strategic Framework Agreement, that has much on non-military, non-security related issues. And there is also some security elements of it. A lot of interpretation is different between how the Americans view it and how Iraqis have expectations, those who read it at least. But we see that there is more on the ground, more follow-up on the military security and counterterrorism side for obvious reasons. But what is holding people from both sides, the Iraqis and the Americans, from activating the other articles in the agreement that do talk about education, culture, the economics, all of the other things that the United States can and should provide for both Iraqi interests and also U.S. interests as a partner for Iraq?
Well, thank you. That's a key question. So for the time being, if you will, the Strategic Framework Agreement is very sparse. It does cover a lot of ground, but it's sort of how should I put it, a mile wide and an inch deep. And I think we should deepen it a little more. And there are many reasons for it not being more implemented. First, we need to make it more implementable. So with regard to business, I alluded to this. We recognize that the business environment in Iraq is not very attractive. And this is one of the reasons why the government, and we're very fortunate that our Prime Minister is really, I hate saying nice things about my bosses, it makes me, but he really is a good economist, and he understands the importance of the private sector. And he really wants to make Iraq an attractive investment climate for foreign companies. This is why, I spoke yesterday at the U.S. Chamber, and I called the economic advisor of the foreign minister. What is it that I can tell them? And he said, okay, well, so he sent me 2 draft laws, 150 pages each. I haven't had time to read them. But they do glance through, and they do cover a lot of the issues that many of the businesses that come to complain about, access to land, difficulty in standardizing entrance at various border crossings, visa issues. These, I think, have been resolved. So this is on the Iraqi side. On the American side, we still suffer from the fact that Iraq is classified as a danger zone. This is why I tell people of all the fun I've had in Baghdad, because I want to entice them to come. And people want to come. I will recall with great pleasure that last year, the U.S. Chamber's overseas trip with businessmen to Iraq was the largest they took anywhere in the world in 2018, headed by Secretary Perry, yes. As you recall. So there's room for improvement on either side. One of the things that I'd like to see is the United States diplomats to be more visible in Baghdad, to go around and meet with people. And for example, now that the conditions, I think, are more conducive to it, to reestablish the consulate in Basra, as an example.
Of course. And let me expand on something you mentioned about this agreement, that it is sparse, and I agree that it doesn't specify. One of the reasons is because of the time that it was signed in and also the circumstances. You think that Iraq and the United States, or even if you don't want to say what you think, if you evaluate the idea of whether or not Iraq and the United States would have a renegotiation of the agreements that are existing, or maybe have a new agreement altogether going forward, not as the kind of relation between the two countries in 2008, but according to the kind of relations that these two countries have right now, where Iraq is fully sovereign, no U.S., even the shadow of occupation is no longer there. And also, we have a clearer view of what the future looks like, to have maybe a better agreement and more durable, and has more specific obligations from both sides and entitlements? Or is something like this unpopular, or what are the prospects of having an agreement?
I don't think that this would be so much an Iraqi issue as an American issue. American treaties are subject to approval by Congress. But I actually, my quick answer to what you said is whatever works. Okay, but with a caveat that I think there is still enough scope in the current strategic framework agreement to do much more. Let's work it, and if we reach its limit, then let's look at reviving it. But for God's sake, let's do something. I mean, it still allows for a lot of room on things to implement and to work on together. There is one thing though that takes a little longer to. The problem is that most of our negotiations are conducted between people who are not very compatible. The people we deal with on the American side are often businessmen. The people we deal with from the Iraqi side are often civil servants. And there is a gap in culture between both that is quite a problem. And so one of the things that I'd like to do is to see whether we could get more of our leading civil servants working in, for example, state-owned enterprises and things like that, to come and attend courses in the United States to familiarize themselves with the thinking of the private sector.
Okay. Now, if I were then to make a kind of an overall assessment, if I were to ask you to point out one of the things that, or one of the areas, fields that U.S.-Iraqi relations are going exactly where they should be, or making a great progress, what area that would be in your day-to-day work with the U.S. as Iraq's top diplomat here?
There's more than one. You know,
that's even better.
No, there is more than one. I mean, we collaborate nicely at the United Nations. We support each other's initiatives. We still have a very vibrant scholarship program in the United States. The State Department hosts a program where they bring youths to familiarize themselves with the United States. And let's not forget the impact of American companies in promoting things in Iraq. GE is critical to our plans to increase our electricity supply. You yourself mentioned the fact that this was a year, and both of us are friends with the electricity minister, that this was a year where I think we did a lot better than what a lot of people feared we would. Granted, we were helped by an incredibly good water season, but nonetheless, it was a remarkable achievement. And then, you know, well, I don't want to talk too much about Exxon. I'm waiting what their decision is going to be on the Southern Integrated Infrastructure Project. But we do work with a lot of American service companies in the South that have helped us reach a plateau of production that we had never reached before. I mean, I look, in 2011, the International Energy Agency comes out every year with this World Energy Outlook. And every year they focus on a given country. So in 2011, and again in 2017, they focused on Iraq. In 2011, they came out with 3 scenarios. Worst case scenario, where they anticipated that by 2020, we'd be at 4 million barrels a day. A really positive scenario in which they anticipated that we'd be at about 8 million barrels a day. And a realistic scenario, which was at 6 million barrels a day. Now, with the ISIS stuff, with all the trouble we've been at, it looks like we're going to be at 6 million barrels a day in 2020. That's actually quite remarkable. You know?
It is remarkable, but how are you going to sync that with the demands from OPEC that they always try to keep the production in levels they prefer rather than what Iraqi economy would like to see, and especially, you know, on countries like Iraq that.
Well, I'm not talking. I'm talking about capacity to produce.
Capacity to produce,
capacity
but
to produce.
The actual production. So, what's the point of capacity if you are not going to translate?
Well,
that
when the
into
price
dollars?
of oil goes up, man, let me tell you, you will want that production capacity. I wish we had it in 2000, 10 and 8, and
okay.
You know, it's. I mean, it's infrastructure. It's something that we really need.
Okay.
mind you, we always talk about oil. We don't talk about gas. Iraq has a potential to also to be a gas exporter, although the current immediate plans are to use gas for electricity production.
And you mentioned in your talk that agriculture is another thing you are looking at, as well as, of course, oil, which is right now the main source for Iraqi budget and for Iraqi economy. But I mean, if you recall something that a while back, Professor Ali Allawi and our friend Luay Al-Khatib and myself talked about what Iraq needs to do for the future, at least by 2030 or others, is really to significantly increase the revenues, not just what the oil is giving and the agriculture. That is not just to, right now, Iraq is good at paying the salaries, but there is also a hefty 90 billion plus bill for reconstruction of post-ISIS. There is also the rebuilding and also development of the infrastructure that hasn't seen any development probably since the 80s, when diversion of all of the revenues were more towards war efforts, and later on the sanctions, where Iraqi infrastructure remained on really very little maintenance, if any. What are other areas that the government thinks that can be sort of quickly can be activated, in which sectors where you could really generate more revenues for that?
Well, I'd like to stay on agriculture, because it's a very telling example. And it's something that, if any journalist there, it's a topic to write about. So the most visible thing about Baghdad is that you no longer see these tunnels of T-walls. At the same time, this year, we were blessed with a great water season, which meant a season with a bumper crop of wheat. And to such a degree that the crop exceeded our silo storage capacity. So 2 young guys, one an engineer and the other a military guy, got together and found a wonderful solution. They took these T-walls, put them in circles, and turned them into silos, okay? This is one of the greatest examples of economies of scope I can think of, okay? I mean, anybody from the Wall Street Journal, you should write about this, and so you cover them with tarpaulin, and there you go. And more to it, what the government did is it bought the entire crop from the farmers and paid them right away, so that they can already invest in next year's harvest through, for example, equipment that would allow them to tap into groundwater, so that they would be insulated from any shortages of rain. And then to use the grain that the government has bought, either to give to the population as part of the food rations, or else to give it to food industries, and so some sort of agricultural Keynesian economics. Now, I think it's really great. I mean,
it sure is. Any other sectors you think in Iraq that are ready to generate money rather than just put a lot of money of investment?
Tourism.
Tourism.
Tourism. I mean, we have, today, as Ashura, as I mentioned, sadly we've had a stampede that killed about 30 people, but overall, we get hundreds of thousands of people to come to visit the shrines, and it's a process that is ongoing throughout the year. It's like Lourdes, or in fact, the French were very intent whenever they brought these visitors from Iraq who were from Najaf or from Karbala. They'd make a point of taking them to Lourdes so that they could hook them on the French expertise in handling visits by pilgrims and things like that. Right. Is there anything like this in the U.S.?
I don't know. People might tell us. Shifting towards the Iraq's domestic issues, 2 things that are really always on the mind of people. One of them is on the human toll of ISIS, and there is a lot we can talk about in post-ISIS. Definitely the reconstruction, and we can talk about it now or in the Q&A, but also the IDPs. I think it is more pressing than, even though they are one thing that leads to other. In order to have the IDPs, the number that I see, many numbers now, more than the 1.5
5
million people
yeah.
that are still in camps. And these are the ones who are in camps. And I can tell you that probably, and you know that very well, that there are people who are not registered or considered as IDPs, those who moved to other provinces and made a life and didn't go to camps, but just rented houses and got jobs, etc. But for them,
relatives.
Sorry?
Or stayed with
or
relatives.
stayed with relatives, etc. Yeah, that's right. And you know, to reconstitute these communities and bring people back, you know, it does take a lot of reconstruction, but also there is more to that. I think it's the reconstruction in terms of non-physical reconstruction, but social reconstruction that needs to be done. First of all, what is the government plan on that, and what are the good signs, if you know, if you were to share with us on where this is going, and what are the obstacles that you see that still make this a heartache for the Iraqi government, for the IDPs, and also for the international community?
This is the problem. First of all, you have to take care of the trauma of the survivors and bring closure to them, especially those that have been minorities that are particularly targeted by ISIS. And there I think we do have some support from the international community. There is a special representative, I don't know what his exact title is, Karim Khan, who is
Yes.
looking to help identify the various aspects of this issue and to help bring some closure to people. Beyond that, the real issue is trying to find a way of helping people come back in without, but quarantining, and I'm using this word advisedly, the virus of ISIS. And I don't have a solution for that. It's something that will require a lot of resources. The Iraqi government has issued some proposals to the international community, all of which require considerable resources. I mean, staging areas, camps, even a prison for ISIS terrorists and the recalcitrants. Like I said, this is something that we cannot do on our own, and this is something that the international community has to help us deal with, not only in terms of foreign direct investment, but as part of your defense budgets. Because in doing so, you are protecting yourselves. It's an ongoing process, and it'll be with us for a while. I mean, think only of the children that were brainwashed and were forced to do things that were horrible. Some of them are being made to leave their re-education camps before the process is complete, and they are therefore still at risk of, you know, falling back into the ISIS stranglehold. It's not easy.
It is not, yes.
But like I said, I mean, this is something where we all have to pull together and be generous.
Right. The other issue that really also is standing as one of the post-ISIS problems, and you know, this is again the reality of life, the trauma that Iraq had with ISIS changed the game of where Iraq was going by 2014, and what it had to shift many of its plans is the weapons that are in the hands of non-state actors. And these are two kinds of weapons that I'm thinking about. One of them are the ones that were needed and necessary to defeat ISIS. All of the groups that were formed either were reconstituted, they were before 2011 and reconstituted, or the ones that were formed after the ISIS crisis. And there is no doubt and no argument that these weapons and the people who held them helped save Iraq from an existential threat. But as it happens always, when weapons go in private hands, you know, once the threat is over, those weapons become a threat of their own. And also there are weapons that many people are not talking about in non-state actors' hands. Those are the weapons with the tribes. many of the tribes in Iraq and places like Basra and others, some of these fights are military combat style, and sometimes even the government doesn't, know how to sort of put it down until some other unconventional mechanisms to stop it. Where are we going to be in the near future about these weapons? And I would like to hear from you a sort of a non-conventional answer, because a lot of people think about it from a Washington side of looking at it as a problem, but also from an Iraqi point of view, how Iraqis see their priorities vis-a-vis these weapons, whether in the hands of the PMUs or in the hands of the tribes. Because definitely there is, I think, reading the literature about the PMUs, a lot of ideology sometimes drives the narrative rather than what is on the ground. But also there are issues that need to be addressed, and speaking with Iraqi officials, they too mentioned that this is on their mind. The Prime Minister just issued a decree. Parliament had a law in 2016 to address this issue. So if you update us, but with really a flavor of how Iraqis view this issue and how they are planning to handle it, rather than what we read often from the observers, outsiders, etc.
Well, this is not as easy as you would think. But the main point is that the government is really intent on having a monopoly on weapons. You can't have a civic or a civil or a republican society without adhering to this. And this is the reason, in fact, behind the executive orders that were issued by the Prime Minister, first Abadi and then Adel Abdul Mahdi. Easier said than done. Like I said, we're in a post-conflict situation. I remember many years ago reading an article talking about just a country that emerged out of a war and with tensions between the regions and the central government, with militias holding huge weapons, stashes, even heavy weaponry. And then the question was, Iraq in 2006 or 2007? No, it was Italy in the 1940s, late 1940s. This isn't new. I think we'll muddle through. The only thing that I will say is that things have to be evolutive, and confrontation must be avoided. I mean, you mentioned yourself that the Hashd is not without its supporters. It did play a considerable role, actually an essential role, in preventing Iraq from falling to ISIS. For God's sake, they were, on the outskirts of Baghdad, and they could have overtaken Erbil, here's a thought. I mean, had they consolidated, we would have been split up, built like the Biden-Gelb plan. But that didn't happen. I think at one point I said that, just to paraphrase George Kennan, ISIS itself contained in itself the seeds of its own destruction. What I will also say is that the population at large wants the reestablishment of public order. So by and large, this is something that the Iraqis want, and therefore there is strong support for the executive orders that the Prime Minister has issued, and there is recognition of them by the PMUs. Note that the most recent one of these executive orders had a due date. It was supposed to be the 30th, the 31st of July. This is a novelty. Usually we have orders and we don't, we're very lax with time, so to speak. So, due date. On the other side, those responsible for the popular mobilizations did not dismiss it out of hand, and they said, okay, we will try to do that, but we're asking for a little bit of a delay, about 2 months. All of this is reasonable. And I think the main criterion to keep in mind when you're looking at this is reasonableness. Don't do anything rash. Keep the trends in the right direction. and hopefully we'll get to where we need to go.
Thank you. I could go on, but we have a great crowd here, and let's have some questions. And the operative word here is questions. Please identify your name.
I would very much like to hear your opinions.
All right, he overrode me. All right, so there are microphones, I think, right? Barbara.
Thank you, Abbas. Mr. Ambassador, it's such a pleasure to have you here at the Atlantic Council. I remember when you were working with Adnan Pachachi. My God, it seems like 3,000 years ago. But it's wonderful, and you're doing great work for Iraq here, I think. Question I have is about, you mentioned Iraq wanting to control its own airspace. We've had a couple of incidents where the Israelis apparently have bombed what they call Iranian targets in Iraq. Iraq does not have diplomatic relations with Israel. I wonder if a message was sent to Israel, and if so, how, asking them not to violate Iraq's territorial integrity in this way.
We do not have relations with Israel, nor are we likely to have relations with Israel. There is an investigation ongoing. The Iraqi government reserves the right to take the appropriate measures through international fora, international means, Security Council, what have you, to address these concerns. But like I said, the Iraqi government is intent on ensuring that it has control of its airspace and to acquire the means to protect it. Not to my, we do not have relations with Israel. We talk to some of our friends, though.
The gentleman in the back.
This is Heyman Mirkhan from University of Kurdistan. First
Hello.
of all, amazing presentation. It's good. It feels good as an Iraqi to have an impartial and kind of objective, a political ambassador. Thank you for the service you're doing.
I'm not a political ambassador.
Apolitical.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
You said something about the prime minister and he's good in economy. And do you think that Iraqi has an issue with capitalism? Do you think they are more linked to a command or a state economy? And do you think it's, I put it in the Schumpeter's term, constructive destruction? Does it really work in Iraq? Thank you.
You went to good schools. I mentioned this. There is within the body of the Iraqi civil service still remnants of the command economy that we have had, and actually 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and we need to go beyond that. People, for example, at the oil ministry don't understand the logic animating private oil companies, where return on investment is paramount. In terms of creative destruction, in fact, one could argue that this is what needs to be done in terms of state institutions. When you have bloated state institutions that don't accomplish much, create parallel institutions that will work well. I can give you an example, if you will. The Iraqi Ministry of Higher Education was a very standard, very bureaucratic, not open to the world, because it was closed to the world for 20, 30 years, despite having really exceptional people working there. I have to recognize that. And so one of my friends, Dr. Zohair Hamadi, whom you know, yes. Who had worked as an educational advisor for a long time and was one of the very few people I know who worked as an advisor with Prime Minister Alawi, Prime Minister Maliki, and also with Adel Abdel Mahdi, initiated an initiative to improve higher education and sent thousands of scholars overseas to study. And the problem I have with them is that they're doing so well that they're getting offered scholarships to complete their PhDs, which contradict their requirements to go back. This program has done so well that I think the U.S. Embassy has chosen its selection criteria or process to choose their Fulbright scholars. So it's something that we could done and that can be done and should be done. In terms of the private sector, indeed, there is, the floor is out there for you. If you can bring investors to come in and create jobs in Iraq and add value, you'd be welcome to, even if they will be putting state-owned enterprises that are very inefficient out of the way. The whole idea is that we need jobs and we need more of a value-added part of the chain in Iraq. Well, thank you for your question.
The lady there, just and then.
President Trump just last hour announced that National Security Advisor John Bolton has departed the administration. I would love to get your quick take on this latest development and your reaction to his departure.
Well, I have to say, I met Ambassador Bolton, I think in 2006 when I was at the United Nations. I sort of worked for the United Nations. He's known to have said that you could lop off the 10 top floors and no change would happen. I qualitatively disagree. Maybe the top floor, maybe 1 or 2, but certainly not 10. I mean, the institution is great, but it has certain inefficiencies. And unfortunately, I have not met him. I've met with his predecessors, both of them, but I haven't met with him, and so I can't comment. I mean, this is an American issue.
The gentleman and the lady next to him. Yes. No, right here. Right. Yeah.
Peter Humphrey, intelligence analyst and a former diplomat.
Hello.
I can't believe you know Levittown.
Sorry, who?
I can't believe you know Levittown. It's amazing.
It's a stellar example of American private enterprise. I mean,
Having Israel bomb Iraqi territories, of course, difficult and embarrassing, but the message doesn't really need to be sent to Israel. Do you have the capability, desire, force to send a message to Iran, to beg Iran not to send heavy weapons through your territory so that you don't become a target, and have you done so?
well, for the time being, the weapons that have been targeted are Iraqi weapons. The Papa mobilizations are part of the Iraqi armed forces, and so what we see as being targeted are Iraqi units. I mean, no country has any business bombing our territory. Let's put it at that. We refuse that categorically.
The lady.
Ragad Al-Saadi, founder of Polar Lights Prime, a consultant for humanitarian and stabilization operations in the Middle East. My question is related to post-ISIS. Recently, I'm working on a research paper related to how terrorists are benefiting from humanitarian assistance in the region. And I came across that ISIS, after they have been defeated from Iraq and northeast Syria, they have big transactions of money that are now invested in a private sector and legitimate businesses. So, are there any measures in Iraq to track the resources that are taken by ISIS in order not to come back to regroup?
Oh, for sure. Defeating ISIS militarily certainly is not enough. There are two additional aspects to the fight against ISIS. One is drying up their funding resources completely, and that addresses your issue. And the second is, of course, combating and completely devaluing their message. There are processes in Iraq to work on trying to find out more about the financial aspects that you mentioned. What makes it difficult is that Iraq is unfortunately still very much a cash economy, and one of the things that we need to do is to bring in more banks to make it more sort of electronic or more documented. And if there are any representatives of American banks in Iraq, please, you'll be welcome I'll give you your visas for free. You know.
All right, Mr. Kamil Al-Hassani and the gentleman next to him. There are eyes and looking at me.
Hassani, Iraqi
But,
legal analyst. Thank you, Dr. Abbas. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for cover all the subject. My question, the rule of law in Iraq is not very well in any subject you're talking about. Rule of law in Iraq is destruction. Who produce the Daesh, corruption, election, fraud, and grievances in all the provinces in Iraq. What the Iraqi plan to enhance the rule of law? Why the Iraqi don't try to use the capability of American to enhance the rule of law, which is the most important to Iraqi for economic side, political side, and social side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's actually a very important question. Thank you for asking it. Actually, I'm a victim of this. I spent much of my time in Baghdad trying to recover, to ensure that the home I grew up in wasn't taken over by some crooks who wanted to change the registrations of the deeds in Baghdad. It's a real issue, and I think the best way for the government to fight corruption, I mentioned it, is to move away from such economic processes that foster corruption, like a cash economy, into something that is more recordable, more traceable. One of the things, for example, that I'm actually quite happy about is that there is an intention to assign to every single Iraqi an electronically tagged ID card, so that they're completely identifiable and can be traced and tracked and can receive payments that are their due directly. It's an ongoing process. And the other thing that I'll say is that in order for you to be able to fix a problem, fixing the problem will happen much more quickly if you have the right tools to do this. And the problem that we face is that we have to fix the problem while we are making the tools as we proceed. I owe this analogy to Fred Kagan. It's the same problem we had in the fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda before that. We had to engage in a war as we were creating and making up our own army. And he's a historian. He came up with the other example that illustrates this, and that's the Red Army in the 1920s, when they had to fight the White Army and then yet train at the same time, about 100 years ago. So it's not an easy issue, but trust me, we're hopeful that it'll be addressed.
Jerry Hyman at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your measured, quiet, reasonable discussion, broad-ranging. You mentioned very briefly the KRG.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could expand a little bit more on what you see as the future of the KRG. Obviously, if one were to take a vote in the KRG, I think it's fair to say that probably the overwhelming number of people would vote for independence. So how do you see the KRG and its integration or non-integration into the larger state? Federation, confederation, independence, etc.?
Well, I'm a little biased because I believe in federalism as a solution for Iraq. I believed in that a long time ago. And in fact, in 1992, I used to edit this little publication called the Iraqi File, in which I published the first article that spoke of federal solution for Iraq, authored by a friend, Ali Alawi.
Yes.
So it was reproduced later by Qadri, but it gets quoted as having been published in the Iraqi File. I used to do that all anonymously, by the way, so you won't see my name anywhere. So I do believe in federalism as a solution that will allow Iraq to maintain its unity and at the same time recognize its diversity. I think this answer is best addressed by Kurds themselves. And if I'm not mistaken, not very recently, you had a member of parliament who is from Kurdistan speak at this very same forum, address this issue. Was he off the record or?
No, it was on record.
So on the record, you can look up his answer. I mean, the answer was that there is a consensus now in Kurdistan that the future of Erbil is with Baghdad and not with anybody else. And this is a partnership that, in fact, is not completely mature. I think the Iraqi constitution recognizes the possibility of having other other governorates create regions. And so I think, to me, the right way of looking at the partnership, the Iraqi partnership, if you will, is to talk about Erbil's partnership in Baghdad as a representative of the whole country, rather than with Baghdad on a level of parity. You see what I mean?
All right, the lady.
Tineran Surti. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm from Kurdistan Regional Government Representation. I am having a question, if I may, regarding Turkey and Iran's attacks on the borders. So, sir, do you consider this as Baghdad's issue?
Of course it is. We do not want any
And
encroachment on
and what are
Iraqi-
your actions for that?
We're doing all we can.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe we need to do more.
Good to see you, boss. Mr. Ambassador,
Hi,
could you talk about the state of Iraqi-U.S. relations, both at the governmental level and on the Iraqi street level? We seem to have divergent trends. On the one hand, the electricity waivers continue to be renewed. The United States is still there supporting militarily. On the other hand, we have had several rounds of sanctions against Iraqi figures. America is seen as complicit with these Iraqi strikes, and we all can't help but notice that the Prime Minister hasn't been to town yet. So, given these, disparate sides of the relationship, where do you think the U.S.-Iraqi relationship stands, both at the governmental level and with the Iraqi street?
Well, I will quote as you know, I just came back from Baghdad. So while I was in Baghdad, we had a visit from David Schenker, who's the Assistant Secretary of Near East Affairs, and a call from Secretary Pompeo to the Prime Minister, both of whom talked very explicitly about the possibility of a visit, which is at a date that we had discussed earlier. So this is very much on the books. On the issue of the relationship, well, I had a 90-minute meeting with Hadi al-Amri, who is the head of the Badr Corps. I knew him in his capacity as former Minister of Transportation. And his message was very, very clear. He said, you're the ambassador to the U.S. We want a partnership with the United States, but on certain conditions. Not at the expense of our sovereignty, not at the expense of us being a follower or a tail is the word he used, and with certain guidelines. And he gave actually a very specific message to American businesses. He said, if American businesses come to Iraq, it is the Iraqi population that will be protective of them, because if they quickly see the kind of value added that these companies will bring to their lives. He also made the point that it is not the number of American troops that are in Iraq that will ensure that there is stability or safety. Recall that there were, unfortunately, quite a few casualties when there were large numbers of American troops in Iraq. But in the last 6 months, the only casualty that we have had to suffer was a Marine sergeant who died alongside an ICTS officer fighting ISIS. We mourn them both. On the street level, walk around Baghdad and look at the shops, and many of them have an American flavor. Trust me, there is a willingness for Iraqis to receive American businesses and American know-how. And I'll ask you a quick question. How are you personally received when you walk around Baghdad?
The gentleman here on your screen first.
David Little from Herding Cats Media. The other day, Ted Cruz gave a speech at the Hudson Institute, and it was about Iran, but at the very end, he was asked about an independent Kurdistan, and he said yes, he's in favor of an independent Kurdistan. Do you have any comments on that, or Mr. Cruz's, or Senator Cruz's opinion?
He's not God.
He's not God, no.
No. With all my due respect to him, of course.
No. Yes, the gentleman here. And then, yes, in the back.
David Galloway from the Department of Defense. A cultural question. This morning, the Art newspaper announced that the British Museum was going to transfer part of its Assyrian collection due to storage constraints from the United Kingdom to the United States. Specifically,
say that again?
The British Museum is transferring a large part of its Assyrian collection from the United Kingdom to the United States because of storage constraints in London. Will the embassy have a comment on the transfer of Iraqi antiquities between the United Kingdom and the United States? Thank you.
I wish they would transfer them to the Baghdad Museum. That's my comment.
Hello.
But thank you for raising this. I wasn't aware of that. I'll look into it.
Okay, since you have the mic, you, and then the gentleman in the back. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. This comes from actually personal concern. I was flying from the UK to India. Now, I was on Jet Airways aligned with Delta, and we were flying over Iran. Had somewhat of a medical emergency. I almost thought about eating my passport. Noticed that the other airlines were kind of going through the airspace towards Iraq and down the other way. Now, the safety of the commercial passengers, when we talk about airspace and with current situations, I see that as very serious, and I don't see enough dialogue on the television, and I think that's something that should really unite the international community about safe airspace, because we've got corporations from all over the world that need to get from your neck of the woods or go over your area. And we need some type of safe highway for these carriers so everybody's not kind of, held up at 38,000 feet. Do you have any comments about airplane safety over Iraq? The issue is brought up about the current situation. I'm just talking in general for a long-term solution. There needs to be a long-term dialogue so we can resolve this issue. Because as you have a beautiful airport, I believe, right on the border of Iraq and Iran that is gorgeous, and that would be a great safe haven, like a little Switzerland for, an airport that can be safely used as a hub for people traveling if they have an emergency. So just any type of dialogue on air safety.
Let's combine that with the question of gentleman, because we are running out of time, and probably these will be the last two questions on Ambassador Najib as well.
Mr. Ambassador, Ali Harb, Middle East. You mentioned earlier about the suspected Israeli strikes on Hajj Sha'bi. You mentioned earlier about the suspected Israeli strikes on Hajj Sha'bi that you complained to friends. I'm imagining the U.S. administration was one of them. What do you expect from this administration when it comes to protecting Iraqi territorial integrity from its own allies in Israel? Thank you.
So 2 questions on that.
Is there a representative of the U.S. government you can ask this question to? Look, the protection of our airspace should be our responsibility. We're not in a position to do that in the way we would like to, but I can assure you that we're looking very seriously into how we can do that. That's all I can say about this. Okay.
And on the airport issue.
On the airport issue, so for the time being, I don't think there was one incident many years ago when a DHL flight was bringing in switching stations for in 2003 for the soon-to-be installed wireless network, and it got shot. I think that's the only incident I think that I can recall of a commercial airline running into trouble in Iraq. There are at least a dozen international airlines that fly into all the airports in Iraq: Erbil, Suleimania, Baghdad, Najaf, Basra, hopefully soon Mosul, and we haven't had any issues. Mind you, I think the conditions that govern the transit of airlines amongst countries are managed by an international organization. So we may want to address your question to them. I can't answer that.
Ambassador Najib.
Thank you, Mr. Fareed. Ambassador Fareed, your presentation well said. You covered all aspects.
Thank you, sir.
I have only a small comment in all these questions being raised. What we really need now, we need to regain the confidence of the people. We have some gap. For example, the electricity, we've been working on it for 15 years, spending over 40 billion. Restore electricity, you gain 50% of security. Provide services to the people.
Yes.
Then you can put the plans for it, not only initiative. Then we can cover more of the aspects that we need to build the country. That's really what we need. We have to deal with the unemployment, especially with the new generation. We have 37% unemployment. We need to work with it. I hope the government will have not only initiative plans with the assistance of the NGOs, international organizations, governments, to put a real plans, 5 years plan, 10 years plans, which we can work in it and we say, yes, we are doing something and we're going to rebuild this country. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Well, I'm a little awkward addressing this gentleman because he's a bit of my mentor at the foreign minister when I came in with nothing but no experience in diplomacy. And Ambassador Najib is a seasoned diplomat who had served in many places. He actually was, he ran our nicest embassy anywhere in the world. It's the Iraqi embassy in Vienna, which is a historic, how many of you guys have seen the movie Meyerling? Okay, well, Prince Rudolph met Mary Vetsera in the Iraqi embassy in Vienna, just to tell you. So if you want to visit, if you're visiting Vienna, go check it out. It's really nice. Yeah, thank you for that. But you raise critical issues. The issue of trust between the Iraqi government and the Iraqi population is critical. But I will add that we do have one measure of control that the population has over the government, and that's elections. You know, we've had, despite all the difficulties that we ran into, fairly successful elections, far from perfect, okay, but fairly successful elections, where it is to be stated many of the incumbents don't get reelected. And so that is a measure of control that the population has over their elected officials. And I'm actually, honestly, quite proud of it. And I'm looking forward for the day you run. I'll vote for you.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. We ran a little bit over time, but it was worth every minute of it. I'm very honored to have you, and thank you for accepting the invitation. Thank you to everybody for joining us for this great event. And we would like to see you again and again in our events. And please join me in thanking the ambassador.
Thank you, sir.